Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. For those who I haven't met, my name is Julia Coffin, and I'm the head of partnerships at More in Common. We're really grateful that you've taken some time to be with us this afternoon and to engage in this research. As you know, we recently released a report, Beyond MAGA, a profile of the Trump coalition, which offers a deep look at the composition, motivations, and dynamics shaping the Trump coalition. This afternoon, we look forward to highlighting some key insights that came out of that research and the subsequent report, as well as then opening up the conversation for any of your questions. I'm grateful to be joined today by my colleagues Jay and Daniel, who will be walking us through the findings, as well as Paul, Fred, and Rabia, who are working behind the scenes and will be responding to your questions live. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Jay so that we can jump in and get started.
Thank you so much, Julia. Really appreciate it. Um, all right, so good afternoon. It's great to meet all of you. As Julia mentioned, I'm Jason Mangone. I'm the U.S. Executive Director for More in Common. I'm joined by my colleague Daniel Yudkin, one of the co-authors of this report and the director of our Beacon project, as well as Julia, Fred, Paul, and Rabia from the More in Common team. So, as many of you on this call know, More in Common is redoing its Hidden Tribes project this year. As you can see from this slide, this time around, we're doing that project as three parts, starting with the segmentation of President Trump's voters, which I'm going to brief you on today, followed by a reprise of the original Hidden Tribes, and finally with a deep dive into progressive activists, the farthest left of our Hidden Tribes segment. Before jumping into our presentation, I quickly want to ground people in why we're here. Why are we starting Hidden Tribes with the segmentation of President Trump's voters? So the 2024 election outcome was a clear victory for President Trump. It wasn't with quite the margin that he since claimed, but it was clear nevertheless. Of course, once it happened, there was plenty of media commentary saying that it was inevitable. But the reality is the outcome challenged a lot of conventional wisdom. That is to say, the coalition that President Trump brought together is not what people were imagining for the last decade. He won the popular vote. We saw young people shift to President Trump. He increased his vote share with every minority group and actually won the vote of Hispanic men. Even moderates shifted to President Trump. When you win by expanding your coalition, as the president has done, it can become difficult to manage the competing factions within that coalition. Most of the analysis of President Trump and his coalition tends to focus on policy, his leadership style, changes in our culture. And to the extent that it does focus on his base of voters, it tends to analyze them at the level of demography, race, class, religiosity, and so on. Now, at its best, our research at More in Common doesn't simply say, oh, we have more in common than we think we do. As you'll see in this study, sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't. At its best, our work reveals the starting points and values that are often concealed by partisanship, polarization, and analysis that only accentuates demography. So all it is to say, our goal with this study is to try and communicate an understanding of how President Trump's voters understand themselves. That's where we think More in Common can make the greatest contribution. Um, Before Daniel and I walk you through the study, I just have a couple of administrative notes. So Daniel and I plan to speak for about 25 or 30 minutes, leaving about 20 minutes or so for Q&A at the end. You can use the Q&A feature within the webinar to submit your questions at any point during the presentation. If a question is really straightforward, for example, something about methodology, Paul or Fred from our team can respond directly in the chat. If it requires a more in-depth answer, we'll flag it to address live during the Q&A session at the end. You're welcome to pose questions throughout the session. All of the participants on the webinar can see submitted questions, and you can upvote those that you're most interested to help us prioritize. Once Daniel and I wrap up, I'll hand it back over to Julia to moderate the Q&A. So before jumping into the full study, just wanted to note on methodology. So the study includes 6 surveys across 10 months. It's the most comprehensive segmentation of 2024 Trump voters to date. We asked questions to over 18,000 Americans, including just under 11,000 Trump voters. We also conducted about a dozen focus groups and about 26 one-on-one interviews. We use all of that to create what's called a segmentation. The key thing to understand about a segmentation is that we group people based on their responses to political, religious, and behavioral questions. rather than demographic ones. We think that this helps to explain the coalition with as much clarity as possible. For today's presentation, I'll start with a quick overview of the coalition. Then I'll spend most of my time talking about the four types of voters within that coalition. I'll then run through our findings on a couple of issues that are really, really important to Trump voters, immigration and wokeness. And then Daniel will talk about how his voters perceive President Trump's leadership style. I'll then wrap up with a quick conclusion before handing it back over to Julia for Q&A. So here we go. So to many Americans, the last year has felt like a series of crises. Unexpected funding cuts, ICE crackdowns, corruption, self-enrichment, the whipsaw of on again, off again tariffs. The list goes on. If you look at approval ratings, it's clear that the president is less popular now than he was when he entered office. But 80% of his voters are still confident in their choice to vote for him, compared to only 13% who have mixed or uncertain feelings, and only 7% who have some regrets. Of course, if even 7% of his voters went a different way in the 2024 election, he wouldn't be the president. But if your goal is to understand your fellow Americans, it's important to start with the context that 80% of the president's 77 million voters stand by their choice. It's also important to note that the president's coalition doesn't break from him with every event in the news. This particular question asks about the news coming out of Venezuela about a month ago. I chose this because, yes, it's really big news that the president authorized a special operations mission that deposed the president of another country. It's really big news. But in the immediate wake of that operation, there was a narrative that the president was no longer, quote unquote, America first. The truth is, most of his coalition, including pluralities of every type of voter that we identify, felt like that operation aligned with how he said he would govern. The point here isn't to focus on Venezuela. The point is to highlight that specific events in the news, even ones that are as consequential as what happened last month in Venezuela, don't compromise his coalition on their own.
Jay,
But
apologies. Can I interrupt real quick? I'm going to share my screen because I think we're getting some feedback that the slides are a bit small. So I'm
got it.
sorry to interrupt your flow, but if you could
Yep,
just end
no
your screen
problem.
share, I'm happy to pop mine up.
No problem.
Great.
So specific events in the news don't compromise his coalition on their own, but it's of course important to remember that the president has cobbled together a coalition, only some of whom wear the MAGA hat. He hasn't started a cult. In fact, only 38% of the president's voters say that, quote, being MAGA is an important part of their identity. And that varies widely between the four types of voters that we identify in President Trump's coalition. Next slide, Julia. And so you can go to the next slide. And so I'm going to walk you through the four types of voters that we identified in our segmentation. MAGA hardliners on the top left, anti-woke conservatives, mainline Republicans, and the reluctant right. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to accentuate what sets each of these four types apart from other parts of the coalition. Next slide, Julia. So this is a quote from a MAGA hardliner. I'll start with a quote and then give you a little bit of analysis. So Trump fights back and they don't like it. He's a disruptor. He sees the corruption and all the bad things that are going on in this country. And he's the one person who's going to try to fix it, and they hate that. They detest him, and that makes me like him that much more. That's from Gary, a 60-year-old MAGA hardliner from Oklahoma. Next slide, Julia. So who are MAGA hardliners? They comprise 29% of Trump voters, and they're the fiery core of Trump's base. They're fiercely loyal, deeply religious, animated by a sense that America is in an existential struggle. They tend to be older, 3 and 4 baby boomers or Gen X, whiter, less affluent, and less formally educated than other conservatives, but they see themselves as the guardians of a way of life that they believe is rapidly disappearing. For them, the president is not simply a politician, but the champion of their cause. He's someone willing to break with convention to restore what they see as America's rightful greatness. They're skeptical of mainstream institutions, convinced that traditional sources of information have been compromised. They view the conflict between right and left as a struggle between good and evil, with God firmly on their side. This is a conviction reinforced by moments like the failed assassination attempt, which many interpreted as a sign of divine intervention. Their religious faith strengthens their sense of solidarity, and for many, supporting the president is closely tied to living out their religious beliefs. While most continue to voice respect for the Constitution, they're also more open than others within the coalition to the president pushing against established political norms if that's what it takes to secure the future that they believe in. Compared to the average Trump voter, they're the most likely to agree that open borders, crime, and homelessness amount to a crisis, most likely to subscribe to conspiratorial thinking, more likely to say that almost all of their friends have similar political views as they do, most likely to say that the left hates America. 93% of them believe that. Interestingly, despite the fact that they're the oldest of the segments, they're also the most likely to have shared political content on social media. That's a little bit counterintuitive, but it aligns with their findings that in general, the most hardened partisans and the most politically engaged people are also the most likely to share political content on social media. Next slide, Julia. So next are anti-woke conservatives, which make up 21% of the president's coalition. So a quote from one of our focus groups here is, I'm noticing on social media that a lot of the conservatives are not afraid to speak up anymore. During the last 4 years with Biden, I think we all took a back seat and we weren't allowed to express ourselves for fear of being canceled or being outed. Next slide, Julia. So this segment, the anti-woke conservatives are well off, politically engaged, and deeply frustrated by what they see as a country slipping away from common sense. One of our focus group participants actually used the terms stupidity and ridiculousness interchangeably with the concept of wokeness. They view the progressive left as the driving force behind that departure from common sense, whether through cancel culture, porous borders, shifting standards in schools, or a biased news media. Unlike the president's most fervent base, their connection to Trump is practical rather than spiritual. They see him as a builder, someone capable of fixing a broken system. Their respect for order and institutions means that they want leaders who follow the Constitution and democratic procedures, even when doing so slows progress. In their personal outlook, anti-woke conservatives are more rationalist than zealous. They pride themselves on valuing responsibility, competence, and individual effort. Even if he doesn't live them out, they do view the president as a champion for these ideals, unlike his political opponents. They vote regularly, take civic life seriously, and carry a strong sense of duty to the nation. For them, the president represents a means to restore America to a state that they believe was stronger, more secure, and more practical. Compared to the average Trump voter, they're the most likely to be high on income and suburban. They're the most likely to believe that American identity is, quote, disappearing. They're very cold in their feelings toward outgroups like Democrats, undocumented or illegal immigrants. They're distinctly approving of the president's approach to culture, government efficiency, and foreign policy. They're also the most likely to have voted in a local election, and they're the most likely to say that their faith does not influence their politics. Next slide, Julia. So the next slide is the next group is mainline Republicans at 30% of the president's coalition. Here's a quote from John, a mainline Republican from New Hampshire. He made a lot of promises that I could get and move forward with. I don't want the United States to turn into California. I don't agree with any of the things that Harris was for. I'm not necessarily 100% pro-Trump all the way, but I am a Republican, and that's just the way I needed to vote. Next slide. So mainline Republicans are steady conservatives who are largely disconnected from the day-to-day of politics. They're practical, patriotic, and measured. They're drawn to the president not for his flair or his showmanship, but for the way that he advances familiar conservative priorities. Securing the border, keeping the economy strong, preserving a sense of cultural stability. Their respect for order and tradition makes them pretty uneasy with breaks from political norms, things like January 6th or the president's occasional talk of pushing constitutional limits. But overall, they see his leadership as a force for good. And they believe Trump is getting it right on issues like immigration, for instance. For them, the president embodies the qualities of determination and boldness that they believe are needed to confront the problems facing the country today. The cohort with the highest percentage of women They reject the more aggressive tactics that the president sometimes takes against political opponents. Instead, they're practical, patriotic, and measured. They want a leader who can balance firmness with responsibility, someone strong enough to deal with tough challenges, but grounded enough to preserve order. They don't want disruption from Trump so much as they want someone who can advance the conservative values they believe best serve the nation. Compared to the average Trump voter, they have the largest representation of female voters as well as Latinos. About 13% of this group are Hispanic or Latino, compared to about 8% of all Trump voters. They have a very broad set of motivations for having voted for the president. About two-thirds of them say the Republican Party under President Trump, reflects their values more than before, and 60% say that Trump is the best GOP leader of their lifetime. Relative to other groups, they're the least likely to say that America is in decline. They're also the least conspiratorial group in the coalition. Next slide, Julia. And the fourth and final group in President Trump's segment is the reluctant right, which make up 20% of the coalition. This is from Amara, a 40-year-old Black woman from Pensacola, Florida, and a member of the reluctant right. He's not perfect. He's not going to always make the right decisions, but he's on a path that sits along with my values. Next slide. So as you can probably tell by the name, the reluctant right is the most ambivalent part of the president's coalition. They're reserved and they're cautious. Many of them cast their vote in favor of the president simply because they found him, quote unquote, less bad by the alternative, and occasionally heard that they voted that way because a friend or a close family member encouraged them to do so. They dislike the president's divisive rhetoric. They describe him often as, quote, arrogant, and they say his immigration policies go too far. They follow politics less closely than other Trump voters. And when they do turn their attention to political issues, they often find themselves torn between conflicting values. For example, torn between order and compassion on immigration. They tend to avoid discussing political topics with friends and family, partly because they feel their views are often in the minority, and partly because they prefer to avoid political topics altogether. At the same time, they're concerned about the direction of the country and believe that open borders, crime, and homelessness have pushed the country into a crisis. What they want is strong, competent leadership to steer the nation, which is why, more than any other group, they describe the president not as a traditional politician, but as a CEO running a company. At their heart, the reluctant right value fairness, stability, and the hope that Americans can rise above their divisions to work together on common problems. Compared to the average Trump voter, they're more than twice as likely to say they voted for candidates from multiple parties. They're less likely to say that their friends have similar political views as they do. They're the most likely to say that both the left and the right care about America. And they're the most likely to say that they're ashamed of what happened on January 6th. Next slide. So before jumping into immigration and wokeness, wanted to pause here very quickly to say that, to explain why we do a segmentation. So because the segments, and the reason we do that is because segments usually have more explanatory power than a demographic or political category that might be associated with a particular viewpoint. For instance, MAGA hardliners are more likely to say that the left is an existential threat to America than are Trump voters who identify as very conservative or evangelical. Reluctant right voters are less likely to agree with this statement than any one demographic category. Next slide, Julia. Similarly, MAGA hardliners are more supportive than strong Republicans about the idea of Trump running for a third term, whereas reluctant right voters are much less likely to support a third term than Trump voters who say they aren't strong Republicans. So I like to share those as context for why this type of segmentation analysis is particularly useful. And now I'll jump onto a couple issues that are pretty salient to the Trump coalition. So next slide, Julia. Next slide, please. So on immigration, an important starting point is that Trump voters feel just as warmly toward illegal immigrants as Americans do on average. What sets them apart is their much colder feelings toward illegal or undocumented immigrants. Next slide, Julia. For the most part, Americans are torn between the impulses of hospitality and self-interest when it comes to immigration. Trump voters, alternatively, unabashedly say that our immigration system needs to serve American interests above all. Um, every segment within President Trump's coalition says that our immigration system it should serve Americans first. This doesn't mean that they hate the idea of immigration, but they do believe that any system of immigration needs to prioritize the needs of existing Americans. Next slide. Um, this quote sort of puts it pretty nicely. This is Gloria, a mainline Republican from Miami, who is herself a Hispanic immigrant. I'm not against immigration, but it has to be legal. You have to respect and wait for your turn. This is not a place that you can come in when you want it and do whatever you want. And on top of that, get all the benefits. That's illegal. If you want to come, do it legally and respect the rules. Next slide. What this gets at is that Trump voters don't have strong opinions about limiting immigration overall, but they do believe we need to have control over who's coming and who's going. They viewed our border policies, especially over the last 4 years, as a bit of an embarrassment and as a bit of a farce. They viewed it as both unfair to people who are waiting in line to come legally and also unsafe. They felt like we didn't have any real sense of who was coming in. So there's no way that our immigration system could have possibly been keeping Americans safe. There's a sense that the system deprioritized the well-being of Americans. With that said, as this slide shows, there are really strong divergences in the coalition when it comes to immigration enforcement. In general, mainline Republicans and the reluctant right are much less supportive than MAGA hardliners and anti-woke conservatives when it comes to the most aggressive immigration enforcement measures. This particular question on the screen shows that divergence when it comes to whether or not the government should deport people without a hearing before a judge. But the trend holds really across any type of aggressive enforcement measure. Next slide. While there is divergence, particularly when it comes to enforcement, his voters still trust the president on immigration much more than they trust his political opponents. Yes, many Trump voters, especially mainline Republicans and the reluctant right, don't like what they've seen in Minnesota. Uh, this number that you see on your screen is from a poll in early January, just before the shootings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. And at that point, only 13% of Trump voters said that the president was going too far on immigration. I suspect that number has ticked up a bit since the events in Minneapolis, but the trend holds. The president's supporters trust him more than they do his political opponents because they don't trust that his political opponents take border security all that seriously. Next, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about another issue that sort of binds the coalition together, which is a rejection of wokeness. You can go to the next slide, Julia. So, over the a story that you hear again and again is that since the 1960s, institutional trust has been on the decline in America. Um, that's true across the country, whoever you vote for. But among the president's coalition, there's a shared sense of why we can no longer trust our institutions. When asked, do you agree or disagree with the statement, the woke left has ruined American education, news, and entertainment? 76% of Trump voters agree with this, compared to only 42% of all Americans. His voters perceive collusion between our institutions and progressive goals. This resentment isn't overwhelming across all the voter types, but it is universal enough amongst the most engaged Trump voters and prevalent enough even among the reluctant right that it's an important part of what brought the coalition together. There's a shared sense that they've been signed up for an agenda that they sort of never agreed to. Next slide. Here's a quote from a MAGA hardliner that sums up the perspective pretty well. To me, woke has become a negative term. It seems less about real fairness and more about forcing extreme ideas, silencing opposing opinions, and dividing people. It feels like it's gone from awareness to intolerance. Next slide. So I think there's a narrative, not held by many, but held by some, that Trump voters want a country that favors white Americans, or a buzzword that's out there right now that favors heritage Americans. Um, Certainly that exists within the coalition, to a small degree. But what most Trump voters believe in and what they want their political leaders to believe in is a country where everyone of every race has the same opportunity to succeed. As this slide shows, um, Trump voters want to believe in the idea of a meritocracy, that regardless of where you come from, everyone has the same opportunity to succeed. And I think that that's a story that the president has been pretty successful in telling. And with that in mind, I'm going to hand it over to Daniel to talk a little bit about how his voters perceive President Trump as a leader.
Thanks, Jay. So one of the things that we tried to do in this report was, one of the main kind of motivations for this was, can we see the world and can we see Donald Trump through the eyes of the people who supported him? And so what I want to talk to you about now is just some of the ways that we've been kind of the analyses that we did to try to make sense of this question. Next slide, please. So one question you could ask is, how are people thinking about the motivations that are driving Donald Trump? We asked people, what do you think mostly drives him? What are his core motivations? Is he driven by love of America? Is he driven by personal gain or a mix of both? Now, US citizens on average think that about 50% say that he's driven mostly or entirely by personal gain, but that's not the case among the people who voted for him. For the most part, on average, more than half of Trump voters think that he's driven entirely by love of America, and only a third by a mix. Now, this, of course, varies a little bit by cohort, where you have 85% of MAGA hardliners seeing him as driven entirely by love of America, whereas among the reluctant right, that's significantly less. But even so, even among the reluctant right, more than half of them see him as driven at least somewhat by a love of America or either a mix of that and personal gain. Next slide, please. We also were looking at how people grade or evaluate Trump's foreign policy and policy decisions. So on average, Trump gets Fs across the board among Americans on average. But between his cohorts, there's quite a lot of difference. So you see that on things like immigration and foreign policy, he's getting the best grades. Um, and for the economy and healthcare, he's getting the worst ones. But the thing that's interesting to us here is that the variation between issues is actually less than the variation between the cohorts. The reluctant right is giving him Ds and Fs pretty much across the board, regardless of what issue you're talking about, whereas he's getting mostly As from MAGA hardliners. And what this suggests to us is that for many of the people in his coalition, they're not so much focused on the issue by issue grades, and it's more a general sense of their overall orientation towards the president rather than fine-grained distinctions in his attitudes or decisions about particular policies. Next slide. Another kind of interesting thing to note here is that affordability continues to be a topic of conversation and controversy in America, and it continues to be an issue. But the thing that we noticed and we observed here is that Trump voters are 4 times more likely to continue to blame Joe Biden than Donald Trump for high prices. So you see on the left here the column. So we asked them, which of the following do you think is most contributing to the affordability and cost of living issues in the US? 40% of Trump voters say that President Biden's leadership is having the most important effect, where only 10% on the far left of that bottom row say that it's President Trump's leadership. Next slide. And so what this contributes to is what Jay referred to earlier, which is that we see fairly limited and for many people surprisingly stable degrees of support for changes in support for Donald Trump. So little change in support and mostly stable. The one exception for this is the reluctant right. So you can see about 40% of the reluctant right say they still feel very confident in their choice. And it's upticked in terms of the number of people who have regrets from around 15% to about 25% among the reluctant right. But these are people who are tepid for him, tepid toward Donald Trump from the beginning. The remaining 3 cohorts remain quite confident in their choice and have showed little changes in their sense of regret for him. Now, I will note that this was prior to the shooting of Alex Preddy. And so it's possible that there has been some changes here, But given the data that we've collected so far, we would expect that this would be in the single digits. Next slide. And so the question that we're asking here, the question that kind of animates this work is, given this strong and consistent level of support, what is it about Donald Trump? What is it about his leadership? And what is it about the way that they perceive his leadership that leads them to have such kind of continued loyalty and affinity for the president? And the way that we can make sense of this is by identifying four particular symbolic roles that Donald Trump plays for his supporters. What does he do for them? What questions does he answer? And what needs does he meet? And the first role that we identified is that of a builder. So it's commonly thought that Donald Trump was elected president to destroy things, to tear down systems, and of course, to a certain extent, that's true. But one of the main ways and roles that his supporters perceive him as playing is that of a builder trying to fix a broken system. 58% of his supporters see that as the most fitting symbolic role for him. And then a second to that is a CEO running a company. And so, again, what this underscores is this idea that there's really a sense of constructive, that Trump is playing a constructive rather than a destructive role. Next slide, please. The second symbolic role is that of a redeemer. There is a pervasive sense among Trump's voter base that they are disrespected and disliked by their political opponents. So we asked, do you agree or disagree with the following statements? Democratic politicians respect people like me, and Donald Trump respects people like me. On average, 21, only a fifth of Trump voters say that they feel respected by Democrats, whereas almost 9 in 10 say that they feel respected by Donald Trump. This differential in respect is something that is allowing them and motivating them to vote for Donald Trump because they see him as someone who can restore their sense of moral and social status in the country. Next, please. The third symbolic role is that of a blasphemer. Um, Again, in this context of the sense of disrespect and a feeling of being kind of looked down on by cultural elites in America, there's not just a desire for redemption, but also a desire for retribution, a desire to stick your finger in the eye of the people who have looked down on you. And so we see, for example, we asked supporters, President Trump should make the left pay for its mistakes and lies. 50% of Trump voters overall endorse that, and particularly among the MAGA hardliners, there's a real desire for payback because of this pervasive sense of disrespect. And this quote, this idea was really nicely captured by this quote by Gina, who said, "Trump is like a gigantic orange flashing middle finger, and I love it." Next slide. The final symbolic role is what we call the grand narrator. So Donald Trump's rise to power can really only be understood in the context of this massive decline in trust in civic institutions and in traditional sources of truth and information. Decline in trust in traditional sources of media, in newspapers, in television, etc. And so in that kind of uncertain knowledge landscape, information landscape, Trump emerged as both a hero and the narrator of his own story. So we asked people, who's the best American alive? And Donald Trump eclipsed the other potential competitors on this, even exceeding nobody from his supporters. And they also see him as someone that they agree with the most about politics, again, far outweighing the nearest neighbors here. And so what we have is Trump kind of being able to tell a story and being able to offer a sense of stability, informational stability, in which he himself is the hero of that story. Next slide. Okay, back to you, Jay, to talk about the choices ahead.
Yeah, so just a couple more slides to get through before we open it up for Q&A. Next slide, Julia. So uh, uh, in a lot of ways, President Trump's coalition is sort of on a knife's edge between urgency to fix problems on the one hand and constitutionality and coming together on the other. Here, for each segment, you'll see their levels of agreement with whether or not the president should test the limits of his constitutional power because regular politics don't work, agreement with the idea that the president needs to fix America, even if it means taking away some of Congress's powers, and the idea that it's okay for the president to ignore decisions by the Supreme Court. The general trend is that his coalition is mixed on answers to these questions, with much higher support among his firmest base in MAGA hardliners, mixed support among anti-woke conservatives and mainline Republicans, and essentially no support amongst the reluctant right. And so, the important thing to notice here is that it's sort of on the knife's edge. The impulse is there within his coalition where things could unravel a little bit. If they don't see political options that meet their needs, this urgent impulse could potentially win out. Next slide. With that said, when given the direct choice between a politics of domination compared to a politics of healing, Trump voters overwhelmingly want a more cohesive, constructive future. One that'll take Republicans and Democrats, even and especially those who disagree with Trump's leadership, who are willing to speak to the 77 million Americans who voted for the president in 2024. And I think that's the big takeaway from this study, whether you're a Republican or you're a Democrat. President Trump won 77 million of our fellow Americans, and any future political project, by necessity, is going to need to be able to speak to that coalition of voters, because as of a year ago, it was the largest coalition in American politics. That's all we have. So back to you, Julia, for Q&A. You're muted, Julia.
Great. Thank you. Thank you both for that really thoughtful and comprehensive overview. Now we'll spend about the last 20 or so minutes on Q&A. As you've been doing throughout the presentation, feel free to drop any questions in the Q&A feature and like those that you want us to prioritize, and we're happy to start there. We'll give folks about 15 seconds to drop in some questions. And while we're doing that, I'll ask Robbie, if you don't mind, please dropping a link to the Beyond MAGA website. Anybody who's interested in exploring the report in more detail can find it there, as well as if you could drop a link to our newsletter. That's a great place if you're interested to subscribe to continue to follow this work and some of the subsequent reports that will be coming out later this year. All right, I see we've got one open question in the chat, so I'll start there, and please feel free to keep populating them. So we have a question or a reflection from Terry. If the majority of the coalition like him because of who he is and what he represents versus the reality of what he's actually doing, do the facts matter? Or asked another way, how can we have conversations that can be focused on the outcome of his work versus sound bites? Any thoughts or reflections there, Jay or Daniel?
Daniel, you want to take that one? Because I think that pretty narrowly focuses on leadership. If not, I have a couple thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it is true that it is less policy focused and more about what he represents. I think the question is, if we're talking about what he represents, what needs does he meet? I think the only place that you can go, it's not about that the facts don't matter. It's that what matters is not about policy. It is about values. It's about these needs. It's about this sense of respect or the sense of grievance or the sense of informational uncertainty. And so to have that conversation productively and to have, hope of sort of like engaging and or even persuading, I think, there is often an impulse to say, well, if you just look at the facts or look at the policy, then you can show how there's a contradiction, or it's not leading to a desirable outcome and that sort of thing. But it has to go deeper and it has to go to the psychology. But there is a conversation to be had there. It's just not the conversation that people often think.
Yeah, and I would also, if you look at other polling, not more in Commons, like the President Trump's approval rating is underwater, especially relative to where it was a year ago when he first took office. So clearly, people are certainly persuadable. Um, of course, there's some part of his coalition, a lot of which is represented by MAGA hardliners, where there's very little that you could point to that would dissuade them from their support of the president. With that being like the first slide we put in here was only 38% of his coalition identifies as MAGA. And so like I think an important lesson is it's a really bad idea to not conceive of many of the voters within his coalition as persuadable.
Great. Thank you. Thank you both so much. Um, let's see, jumping to uh, another question from Brian. So, do you believe another leader with the correct set of values could unite this coalition again, or does Trump have a particular secret sauce?
Take it,
Me?
Jay.
Throwing some hard ones your way.
Yeah, I think it is very, very likely that some number of Republicans, as we head into 2026 and 2028, um, try and replicate Trump's style. And I just think that that's a really, if I were their political advisors, I would tell them that's a really, really bad mistake. Like so much of what Trump does is sui generis, and President Trump's coalition is President Trump's coalition and no one else's. Um, I think that, you'll need to find people that are able to speak to their needs, their values, their psychologies, their wants, their desires. Um, but the idea that someone else is going to be able to come along uh, and speak to them in the same way by like copycatting Trump's style and language, just doesn't strike me as we don't give political advice here at More in Common, but even as a practical political measure, that seems like a pretty bad strategy. That would seem completely inauthentic, particularly compared to the authenticity that many of his supporters perceive from President Trump.
Great. Thanks so much, Jay. I think kind of pivoting back to some of the discussion you guys shared about respect, we have a question from Heather who's asking, how do you square the issue of respect when Donald Trump is objectively disrespectful, whether to fellow Republicans, Democrats, or even leaders from other countries? And I think that was in response to the slide that was talking about Donald Trump respects people like me, or Democrats don't respect people like me. We have a sense of how that might play out.
Yeah, you might be able to find evidence of Donald Trump being disrespectful to his supporters, but my sense is that like he's very much a like he might disrespect every single person except for the people that he thinks love him. Because and so this sense of he's sort of winking at the people who support him as he's disrespectful to leaders, to Democrats, and even to some Republicans if he feels like they're not in his corner. It's the way that he uses this sort of social incentives to cajole and get people on his side. But he has established a unique connection with the people who support him. They feel seen by him in a way that they don't feel seen by other people. And so to the extent that they even just being seen, right? Maybe not even respected, but just seen, that perception of being perceived and seen, I think is enough in a landscape in which they don't feel like they're getting that from other sources.
Yeah, I would the our motivation for asking that question is one of President Obama's political intuitions was people don't vote for you um, because they respect you. People vote for you because they think that you respect people like them. And we didn't share this data in the slide on the screen, but where we are in the state of the country is that Republicans feel like Donald Trump respects them, Democrats don't, and vice versa. Democrats feel like other Democrats respect them, and that Republicans don't. All it is to say, there is a massive political opportunity for any politician that's able to make the exhaustive majority of Americans feel like a leader respects who they are as people. Because right now, respect falls very heavily along partisan lines, and there's a real opportunity for someone to come along and transcend that.
Great. Thanks so much, Jay. All right. We've got another question coming at you, specifically asking about how those voters respond to the extreme. And they're saying nearly indisputable evidence of the corruption of Trump and his family. Do we have any data on his coalition's views on that?
Yeah, do you want to, while Daniel answers this, Julia, can you possibly pull back up the slide under the leadership section that gets to personal gain? I'm anticipating that might be what you talk about a little bit, Daniel.
Yeah, I was going to talk about that, but also, we have some additional questions about corruption. There's sort of a sense, I mean, it obviously depends on the cohort, but the general take is there is sort of like a yeah, but I don't care. Like I know it, I acknowledge it, I think it's happening, and I also it's not that important, or I don't think it's central to the conversation. Um, and so that I think is also part of why you see, for some people, this sense of either that there's a mix of motivations or that he's driven primarily by love of America, even as he is engaging in behavior that's obviously self-enriching, like releasing Trump meme coins. Um, so again, yeah, I think the bottom line is it's acknowledged by many people and not seen as central to his character.
Yeah, and it's slide 32. And so like I would say that in general on this question of yeah, that slide. In general, this question of corruption, you hear three potential responses. Um, uh, one is, yeah, but the left does it too. And they paint equivalence between what happened in the Biden era and what Trump does. The second response that you hear is, sure, he's corrupt, but he's so open about it. Yeah, he's making backroom deals. Yeah, he's enriching himself, but that's what politicians have always done. And at least he's telling me he's doing it. So I can make peace with that because I don't trust politicians anyway. And then third, and this is really, really important, the reluctant right is 20% of his coalition. That's around 15 million Americans. That is a meaningful block of swing voters. Fully one-third of those voters say that President Trump isn't just driven by a combination of love of America and personal gain, but is driven primarily by personal gain. So I think it would be a mistake to say that there aren't a lot of Trump voters out there who don't see the corruption and disagree with it. Um, so I think you see those sort of three responses. Um, uh, the left has done it too. Yeah, he does it, but at least he's straightforward about it. And yeah, he doesn't. I really don't like it.
Thanks so much, Jay. Really, really appreciate that. I'm seeing some questions in a similar theme that I wanted to bring up. Um, Again, with the caveat that More in Common is not necessarily offering political advice, but I think a lot of folks in the audience right now are really interested in hearing one. Do you have a sense of what might be the top 2 to 3 wedge issues that could increase defections away from the Trump coalition? Something like Epstein, possibly. And relatedly, how should Democrats think about the reluctant right segment and what it might look like to pursue votes or support among those Americans?
You want to go for it, Jay, on the
Yeah,
policy
sure.
side?
You start. I can fill
Go
in.
ahead. No, no, you take it.
Yeah. So on the, uh, I'm not going to tell you like what a wedge issue could be. Um, uh, Here's what I can tell you. In the election itself, President Trump's voters, who again included about half of Hispanics, a majority of Hispanic men, more moderate voters than ever, more young voters than ever, greater shares of every demographic category in America than the last two times that he's run for president. What they felt like is that the president's priorities were their priorities. They felt like the president's priorities were the cost of living and inflation, the economy in general, and immigration. And those priorities match with the president's priorities. Most Americans did not perceive that those priorities were the priorities of Democrats. And so I'm not giving you a wedge issue. I'm just saying that if you want to win over the president's voters, the starting point is communicating that I share your priorities. I see the world and I see the problems that you're seeing. The second thing that I would say is that um, people running to either replace President Trump in the Republican Party or to win over some Trump voters into the Democratic Party, there's also like a cultural starting point. Um, this this sense that a lot of our institutions are sort of controlled by a more progressive agenda and a more progressive worldview than many Americans actually share. Um, I think we're probably out of the period where quote unquote anti wokeness is going to drive so much of our politics. But yeah, like a run of the mill American who has slightly right of center views on cultural issues, if you want to win over the president's voters, you're going to need to convince people that you care about those things. And that you're willing to bring into your coalition people that hold, slightly more conservative social views. Anything you'd add, Daniel?
No, I have absolutely nothing to add. That was a great answer.
Great. We have a time for a few more questions. So while folks continue to type those in, I am going to steal the spotlight and shamelessly ask one of my own. Curious team, now that this research is out, what are more in commons like kind of hopes moving forward? What do we hope people will use this for? And what were our kind of key goals in conducting this segmentation study?
Yeah. So I'll say a couple things from my perspective. Uh, One is um, over the course of the next 3 years, the I one of the arguments that's going to dominate our national discourse again and again and again as various flashpoints come up is the president's coalition holding together or falling apart? And often the way that you will hear those issues talked about is, oh, he's shedding Hispanic voters, or oh, he's shedding young voters, or oh, he's shedding male voters. And those demographic analyses are important. But I think that what we've offered is a better understanding of those coalitional dynamics that's more human centered. And so I'm hopeful that as this debate happens again and again and again in our national political conversation of is the coalition holding together or falling apart, that our categories help to offer some explanatory power that's more rooted in how his voters actually view themselves as a part of the coalition and doesn't just reduce people to sheer demographic units. Um, the second thing that I would hope that it contributes is I think we've done a really darn good job of analyzing how, a little bit over half of our electorate views their political lives. And I think that there's a whole bunch of political projects that are looking to win over some number of President Trump's voters. And in so doing, like build bigger tents and help bring people together from different perspectives. And I think that the analytical lens that we provide through our four segments is a really, really good lens for organizations that are trying to sort of bring President Trump's voters into their Big Ten. Daniel, any?
No, yeah, that pretty much captures my view too.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, we have about 5 minutes left. A couple more questions are coming in. We'll start off with, I think in a similar vein, how might those on the call today use the survey and in this report as a conversation starter with Trump supporters?
I mean, one, so if you go on our website, like uh, I forget how many people have taken our quiz as of today, but if you or yourself are a Trump voter or there's a Trump voter in your life, like a really fun way to start a conversation is just to have someone take the quiz and see how much the voter type that our quiz generates like resonates with what type of Trump voter you are. Like to be clear, most of the purposes of this report are not to help with interpersonal relational dynamics, which for any of you, I really, really hope are much deeper and more important than politics, which is like politics is zero sum, life is not. So I hope that you don't use politics to drive most of your personal relationships. With that being said, like having your friend take the quiz might be a fun way to start a conversation.
Great, thanks, Jay. And the team just dropped a link to the quiz in the chat, but it's also available on the Beyond MAGA website. Um, we're hearing from Justin. Curious at any of our in the focus groups or in the surveys that we fielded, did we ever ask about what kind of the ideal end state looked like for any or all of these segments of Trump voters? What are they hoping we're building towards?
Go ahead, Danny.
Yeah, I think that you captured it sort of, Jay, in one of the questions that you were talking about with respect to kind of it's a controversial word, right? The colorblind equal opportunity society, the meritocracy, right? This is for people on the left. Those are almost swear words, right? Colorblind. I don't see color, right? But this is the values that are held on among Trump supporters. Many of them expressed to us both in the conversations that we have in focus groups and through some of these quantitative measures, a sense of wanting to go back to this a quote unquote equal opportunity to society, and how exactly that gets achieved and what needs to be done to do it and whether it's real or illusory. Those are questions that are, obviously up for debate. But I think that, for many of the people who supported Donald Trump, that was one of the primary motivations. Um, Anything to add, Jay?
Yeah, the only thing I would say is like this is one of those questions that I really, really think is on the knife's edge. Um, on the one hand, when you ask President Trump's voters, is the left an existential threat to America? Um, Particularly among MAGA hardliners and anti-woke conservatives, the answer is overwhelmingly yes. Like as I said earlier, um, somewhere hidden, somewhere in the coalition, there is an impulse for domination and outright victory. My side has to win, and that's going to require the other side losing. On the other hand, President Trump has been the dominant force in our politics for the last 10 years, and Americans don't buy into cynical agendas, at least not in the long run. They contextualize their support for the president in constructive terms. And so, like, I do not think that among the four types of Trump voters that comprise 77 million very different Americans, there's a precise end state that fits for all of them. Of course, there's not. With that being said, Americans are hungry for like a constructive, positive project. And I do think that there is some risk that the president's style can often come across as cynical. That'll be okay for some of his voters. I'm not convinced that all 77 million are going to go along with an agenda that doesn't have a constructive undertone.
Great, thank you. We are at 2:30, so I think that's a really powerful place to end. Thank you both, Jay and Daniel, for sharing this research, and thank you all for joining and being part of the conversation this afternoon. We really appreciate it. I know there are still some questions in the chat that we didn't get to, so I'll drop my email address in if you have any questions and you want to follow up one-on-one. Very happy to field those and talk about it. We're going to follow up after this webinar with a recording as well as a link to the full report. Would just encourage you to reach out if you have any additional questions, want to explore how these findings might support your work. Always happy to provide briefings for your teams or the networks that you're a part of and explore opportunities where we can collaborate or work together. So just appreciate you all being here, being part of this conversation and work, and looking forward to continuing this work with you all in the future. Have a wonderful rest of your day.